roads, whatever, and vital public infrastructure of that sort. Accordingly, most cyber weapons and many scenarios for cyber warfare, such as that described in Richard Clarke's book, have been focused upon such targets in apparent violation of the most fundamental principles of international humanitarian law and the just war tradition. Well, critics of that tradition would look at this and say, see, I told you, that stuff is antiquated, it's outmoded, it's useless. We ought not to invoke this for an analysis and evaluation of cyber conflict, especially when the harm done appears to involve little or no loss of life. I think that view of the irrelevance of the just war tradition is mistaken. One of the great experiences, I say as I come towards the end of my own career, privileges that I had during my many years here, was to sit with senior military personnel, commanders, folks returning from various theaters of combat, from the first Gulf War and the second conflict and so forth, and sitting and talking with them, listening to them with my colleagues, and trying to help them understand and develop a fuller understanding of their own professional experience and core professional values, and then try to enshrine those experiences and the underlying values that they had discerned in their practice in your text and in your course. Well, these principles of just war and the law of armed conflict are central to that tradition. So I'm reluctant to just throw them out now, largely because that's really all we've got to help us wrestle with these new problems. They're the only resources we have ready to hand. I think we at least have to give them a try. We have to do as human beings invariably are driven to do. Whenever faced with a new or novel set of circumstances, we extrapolate, as you do in your math class, your calculus, from the known to the unknown by means of analogy, comparison, interpretation. At least we have to make the attempt. We have to explore the intuitive soundness of the results before abandoning these traditions of your profession. Well, what happens when we attempt this interpretive extrapolation that's based on professional ethics? Well, the first thing I discovered as we began to look into the cyber realm was we were immediately confronted with an interesting realization concerning the cultural context or background of cyber conflict. It is, after all, and we call it information warfare. That means it reflects the tolerated and traditional practices of professional communities most deeply engaged in ISR and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. That is, the clandestine services and intelligence communities. These communities are neither identical to nor uniformly coextensive with the community of professional military practice. So a great many military officers are intel officers and often go to work as, for example, General Petraeus has for the CIA or for the other clandestine services. So people move back and forth between them, but they're different and distinct communities. In international espionage, for example, the name of the game is usually thought to be dirty tricks and deception, to steal more information from them than they do from us, and in the ensuing conflict, to do unto them before they do unto you. Well, what has happened inadvertently is that without our full awareness, cyber conflict, I believe, has blurred the heretofore sharp traditional boundaries between espionage, covert action, and ongoing low-intensity interstate conflict and competition on the one hand, and full-scale kinetic conflict and armed combat on the other. Those kinds of conflict were heretofore carried out by members of two distinct professional communities with their own set of rules, laws, practices, traditions, and core values. So in a sense, some of the debate about ethics in cyber war represents the debate between two different professional communities concerning how conflict of whatever sort is best handled. It's important, I think, to realize this and to wonder how the boundaries between the two communities may have moved. How have the resulting rules and conventions pertaining to conflict changed, if at all? Are we speaking metaphorically or are we speaking literally when we describe cyber attacks and cyber warfare? We don't, for example, normally call a massive breach of security by any enemy espionage agents. We don't call that an attack or classify our response as constituting warfare. So how's this all going to work? Well, whenever we find ourselves venturing into a new area of relatively unfamiliar terrain like this, the usual advice is proceed with caution, speak and think carefully, and observe as closely as possible the sorts of behaviors that are actually taking place and are found to test the limits of minimally acceptable conduct. In international law, this is known as the search for emerging norms of state behavior. And here I've argued in my own writings and presentations on cyber conflict that we've begun to have enough experience in this relatively new domain to begin at least to discern, both as individuals and as nations, what we would like to see transpire there, and just as importantly, what kinds of behaviors we would like to condemn and discourage. To show how international norms have begun to crystallize in the conduct of cyber conflict, I'd like to conclude tonight by considering 4 recent instances of such conflict with which the general public, and certainly all of you here, are now reasonably familiar. Those are Russia versus Estonia in 2007, Russia versus Georgia in 2008, Israel versus Syria in 2007, and Stuxnet. Of course, no one has taken credit for Stuxnet, although allegations have flown since its initial discovery by the German cybersecurity expert Ralph Langner around 2009, early 2010. The usual default in cases like this is the attribution problem, is to credit those who smile the most broadly, cough gently, and decline to comment for the record. Likewise, the Russians and Israelis either deny or refuse to discuss responsibility for the other altercations. Well, here I've come to believe, and this is largely a result of the deliberations we've had throughout this year, colleagues, fellows in the Stockdale Center, like Professor Randall Dipert at Buffalo University, and Dr. B.J. Strausser, who will be heading out to work in the Department of Defense Analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School after finishing his term here. Pano Yannikagorgos from the Air Force Research Institute, a cybersecurity expert there. These are all our fellows working on the team. And they've convinced me that the so-called attribution problem is neither all that big nor all that unprecedented. Cyber forensics has taken enormous strides in the detection of crime and the origins of interstate cyber conflict, for one thing. And for another, when in doubt, we could take a leaf from the mystery writer Agatha Christie and ignore the background distractions and all the business going on the margins and focus upon a simple question: who stands to benefit most from the deed in question? Summarize that as, show me the money, I'll show you the murderer, in Agatha Christie's case. Well, 9 times out of 10, you've got your perpetrator, and 90% certainty, as Professor Dipert has advocated in his excellent writings on cyber ethics, 90% certainty probably close enough for government work. An accused government may respond, as Russia did in the Estonia case, that it can't be held responsible for the actions of patriots and criminals or outraged vigilantes within its borders. But we know that that defense is nonsense. It didn't work for the Taliban in disclaiming responsibility for what al-Qaeda did beyond its control but within its sovereign borders. It probably shouldn't be allowed to work here either. Our response should be the same in cyber as in conventional conflict. Either you stop the illegal actors, arrest them, or throw them out and take responsibility for what goes on within your borders, or we will regard you as complicit in these acts. That's a principle in international law that's increasingly come to be called imputed responsibility. That started with 9/11, actually, although it has antecedents. That declaration moves us from the realm of international criminal law alone to that of interstate conflict and the law of armed conflict. And in particular, though this is a matter of controversy between ethicists like myself and international lawyers and others, certainly it's hotly debated in our discussion group and by many who are working in this field. They might disagree and point out the history of states who have resisted being held responsible for criminal activities inside their borders. It's too much, too hard. But the so-called Budapest Convention on Cybercrime actually commits its signatories to just this principle. I don't think people realized it when they signed it, but it was written about the same time as 9/11 occurred. It was actually drafted before that. And if you look at the way it reads, I think it's a fundamental revolution in international law that enshrines this principle of imputed responsibility, at least in the cyber domain. So that principle of imputed responsibility, coupled with cyber forensics and this Agatha Christie or beneficiary principle probably is enough to counter cyber subterfuge and take care of the attribution problem. Besides, if you look back in the history of armed conflict, denials and disclaimers of responsibility and non-attribution are nothing new in warfare. The Italians, remember, denied that their subs had anything to do with sinking British supply ships near Gibraltar in World War II. But when the Brits said, well, I'm sorry about that, but if this happens again, we are going to bomb the Italian peninsula into the Stone Age, gee, the attacks mysteriously stopped. So we do know that people are not forthright about what they do, but they can be persuaded. So let's move to cyber weapons, tactics, and targeting. Estonia represents a wholesale and indiscriminate assault on civilians and civilian and government military infrastructure, almost exclusively, non-military, infrastructure. There were no military targets, and more importantly, no reasonable military objectives served by the attacks. Moving a war memorial from one place of honor to another within one's sovereign borders may be cause for annoyance or even diplomatic protest, but hardly for war, and certainly not for an indiscriminate and disproportionate assault on non-combatants, and that certainly is what the Estonian case was. Stuxnet resides all the way at the opposite extreme. The targets were purely military, no one was killed, no civilians or civilian infrastructure were deliberately targeted. The damage done and the harm suffered was surely proportionate to the threat of harm posed by the target itself. And most importantly, every conceivable effort short of attack was undertaken to persuade the adversary to cease and desist. I'll come back to this in a moment as I wrap up, but I want you to notice how what in ethics and in law we call these new norms of interstate conduct are already emerging from these instances. The middle ground in the debate is occupied by the Georgian and Syrian cases. Here the Russians, or whomever, showed both discrimination and restraint. They employed cyber tactics together with conventional warfare to destroy first, to disrupt the adversarial government and military's command and control preceding their conventional attack, which was limited, in turn, to forcing a resolution in their favor of a specific issue that was in dispute, the status of the breakaway province of Ossetia and the fate of ethnic Russians who were living there. Well, this is a perfectly acceptable wartime tactic. We probably choose to side with our NATO ally in Georgia in that dispute, but it is a legitimate interstate conflict, a difference of opinion with reasonable claims on both sides. Baron Clausewitz might scold us that this is what wars are designed to solve. Ditto in the case of the alleged Israeli bombing attack on the illicit Syrian nuclear facility at Deir al-Zawir. A cyber attack utterly dismantled Syrian air defenses, permitting a conventional bombing raid on the nuclear weapons facility undertaken at night when deaths and collateral damage might reasonably be minimized, and presumably after diplomatic initiatives to cease and desist had utterly failed. Now, notice in those cases, I'm trying deliberately not to impose my judgment of the merits of each side's dispute. I'm only trying to describe how they came to resort to war, how they conducted their conflict with cyber weapons and tactics. And here, I think, as a result of what we see in that range of cases from Estonia through Syria and Georgia to Stuxnet, a list, a wallet card, if you will, that wonderful, elusive thing we're always looking for. Can you boil the philosophical arguments down on a single card we can carry in the wallet or a single PowerPoint slide? Here's the PowerPoint slide. You see enough PowerPoint, so I'll just tell you. The cyber attack is morally justified and perhaps should be legally sanctioned whenever the following conditions are met. First, the underlying issue in conflict is sufficiently grave to constitute what the lawyers call a casus belli, equivalent of an armed attack, cause for war. Secondly, only the adversary's military assets are targeted, and the harm inflicted, kinetic or cyber, is proportionate and reasonable in light of the threat posed by the targeted assets. Thirdly, civilian lives and infrastructure are not the intended object of attack, and every effort is made to avoid or minimize damage to those. And finally, fourth, every effort has been made short of war to resolve the dispute in question. Frankly, I think that's a pretty good list, pretty good place to begin. And it constitutes a good beginning for the ethics of cyber warfare. It sorts out these examples into acceptable and unacceptable modes of conduct. It seems to explain our different responses and intuitions about each, independently of which side we politically favor in the dispute. And in that sense, it provides a reasonable guide for action. The rules, if there are to be any rules, ought to be something that all parties to the dispute or competitors in the game or whatever it is can recognize as binding on them and as working essentially in their favor. So I think this offers a reasonable guide for action in the future. Interestingly, as the case of Stuxnet suggests, these norms seem to permit even a preemptive or preventive cyber strike, as well as guide our thinking about retaliation from an unacceptable strike on our own assets. That is, the guidelines appear, at least, to work for both offense and defense. If you remember, we had quite a debate about that during the last decade with regard to conventional arms and so-called preemptive or truly preventive self-defense. But notice that comes up in the cyber realm, and the case looks stronger there. I conclude with this observation. In fact, something like this very list of criteria, which I have elicited from these 4 cases, and you can find the cases themselves described in detail in Clark's book and also in Brenner. Something like this list of criteria can be discovered in an interesting and path-breaking article on ethics and information warfare, authored over a decade ago by Professor John Arquilla, who is chairman of the Department of Defense Analysis at NPS. He's my colleague, and B.J. Strausser is going to work in that department, and for him at the end of this school year. That article was buried in an otherwise obscure RAND Corporation report issued in the late 1990s, co-edited by, among others, Andy Marshall. Look at that and say, whoa, dude, Andy Marshall, really? The famous DepSecDef? The founder of DARPA? Could it be? Nah, probably not. Probably no more the real Andy Marshall than I'm the real George Lucas. But, you know, who knows in these things? Arquilla himself, John Arquilla, is quite eminent in international relations, but he's not an ethics guy. And you'll find his work, if you Google him after tonight's talk, throughout the pages of journals like Foreign Policy and Foreign Affairs. He's perhaps one of the 100 most respected intellects in the country today. Interestingly, when he turned to ethics issues in this new area, he based his analysis almost entirely on his previous collegiate understanding of traditional just war doctrine. Well, our team of resident Stockdale Fellows was working on the Stuxnet case a couple of years ago when Colonel Ed Barrett, our research director, first came across this article, showed it to us. After reading it, I contacted John to introduce myself and ask him, I actually wanted him to speak here to you guys at a Stutt Lecture, but also to a consortium, an international consortium of schools and colleagues in engineering and ethics and law and so forth who work on national security issues. I pointed out the coincidence in this article, and I remarked, John, it seems to me as if whoever developed this incredibly sophisticated weapon not only read your article, but followed its resulting ethical guidelines to the letter. He didn't say anything, and then he smiled broadly. He coughed gently, and he declined to comment for the record. Well, thank you for listening tonight, and I'll be happy myself to comment for the record if there are any questions or comments. Thank you very much. Jeez.
Thank you. We'd like to turn it off. They'll turn it on. All right. Thank you. We'd like to open the floor up for questions now. There's one microphone stationed right in front of E and behind you in this section, and also I can run up any microphones to these levels. So any questions you have for Dr. Lucas, please feel free. I can always get it started off with a question, but I think it's in bad taste for first class to do this, so I'm going to let you guys go. So anyone want to take charge, step up to a mic. There's also one up here behind, in front of C. Thank you.
Sir, third class Chester, you brought this up earlier, and I was just wondering about the actual feasibility of a small group to conduct a coordinated cyber attack across the U.S. homeland.
Thanks for bringing that one up. I thought particularly you might be interested in this. Of course, you don't win any contests for betting against the ingenuity and feasibility of people who are up to no good. That said, I think the reason why the terrorist and or teenager scenario, doing something like bringing down the Glen Canyon and Hoover dams, for example, in a cyber attack, the reason why that's unrealistic is this. If you look at things like Stuxnet, you see that it required a lot of sophistication and ingenuity, more than any one person is likely to have, and time. Required a variety of different kinds of expertise and also access to the hardware that was the object of attack in that case. And the last time I checked, it's pretty hard to get a centrifuge or a hydro turbine up the stairs and into the teenager's bedroom, so he can spend a year trying to test his software and see if he can control it and develop a third man kind of mask for it so that the controllers in the power plant won't recognize what's going on. And the other thing, especially with the teenager, that you'll appreciate since you have the same temptations and are successfully resisting them, is that kid, while he was screwing around on Facebook and learning how to be a clever computer programmer, admittedly very, very ingenious, probably was skipping and therefore flunking his classes in physics and electrical engineering and so forth. So he's probably not by himself going to have much of a clue of how turbines or centrifuges operate. And you'd have to have all that information as well as access to them themselves, put all that together. I just don't think that's something, those things don't fit in a little flat in Hamburg either. You know, it just doesn't strike me as a likely prospect. That's a state-centered enterprise to do something like that. And that's good news, not bad, because it means that as malicious as individuals could be in terms of doing vandalism and crime and so forth, they probably can't conduct what are legitimate acts of war by themselves. I think if terrorists could, they would have done it. They can do a lot of other mischief, but they can't do that. And that leaves that in the realm of states. States have interests, and these interests are what we are appealing to in trying to figure out how to govern ourselves and set limits to what we're willing to do to one another in the cyber domain.
Thank you, sir.
Bet. I have one question for you. Is privacy the same thing as anonymity? Do you have a right to not have your identity known on the internet? Can I take a vote? How many think that we do have a right to absolutely disclose our identity, to conceal our identity and be able to do whatever we want on the internet without it being attributed to or accountable to us? Go ahead, it's okay. It's just a generational thing, I think, in parts. A lot of people think, because of course you're doing a lot of role-playing and avatars and so forth. We're not talking about role-playing and avatars. We're talking about people who are engaged in illicit activities. How many think that privacy and anonymity are different things? Most of you, okay. Well, then you are at odds with the majority of people in the internet community, the Facebook users and anonymous and so forth, who all think these are one and the same thing. And I think we need to get that one worked through, or we're not going to get anywhere. Because the things that we need to do to provide security for everyone are not things that infringe on privacy. They do infringe on anonymity. They require, as we do in our, you would know as well as any, you're not anonymous on our Naval Academy web intranet. And why should others be as well? Okay. Any other questions? Comments for me? And then time for you to get back to homework, I think.
Sir, third class Davis, earlier you mentioned that you don't appreciate the difference or how so many people group together all these different things under cyber attacks. Right. And yet while you were mentioning examples, you mentioned DDoS attacks, which aren't really anything other than a nuisance, and websites can be brought up back after a short amount of time. Where do you differentiate between what is actually something to be taken serious and something that isn't, especially when it's conducted by our own citizenry, like anonymous?
Well, it's a very good question, and I don't have a very good answer to it. What I'd say is this, that before we just classify everything as a cyber attack, that we try to at least sort things out into categories that we're relatively familiar with, and then decide whether or not the things that are there in that category constitute causes for reprisal or for armed self-defense, either in cyber sense or in a kinetic sense. So, for example, if you look at most of the kinds of things that are described when someone will say we are under relentless attack from our adversaries, they will mean that our secure systems have been breached, our trade secrets and our military secrets are being examined, spied on, and purloined. This is very serious. This happens all the time throughout history, but never to the degree that the internet makes it possible now. That's the new level of vulnerability. Does the scale of espionage make what was an act of espionage, not of war, into an act of war? Are we to call that an attack now? See, I don't have a good answer to that question. I think the answer to that one is, well, no, not yet. Not unless we can see that the harm being done, and this is the allegation made, the harm being done by this outflow of classified information, commercial trade secrets, military and defense industry secrets, and so forth, is so severe as to compromise our security and constitute harm that's worthy of some kind of response. This is where things break down, where we're just not clear exactly on what to do. But it doesn't help if we call everything from the teenage hacker snooping around and maybe even stealing credit card numbers and stuff, all the way to this espionage, or let alone to an act like Stuxnet, called all a cyber attack. We don't have any way of thinking clearly about this. That's my point.
Thank you, sir. On top of that, where do you think the line is crossed where the government has done so much preemptive defense to where it limits the rights of both American citizens and the entire world in terms of the internet and everything cyber?
Okay. Again, good question. You're asking me to answer something for which we don't collectively, despite our best efforts thus far, have a clear answer. Again, I suggested reasoning by analogy. So you think, suppose North Korea sent covert agents over to the United States who climbed around on bridges in our towns and cities and affixed explosives to the foundations of the bridges. They didn't detonate them, they just put them there. And then somehow they wired these all up so that they could later, when there was a conflict, they could blow things up and cause tremendous damage. Something like that in the cyber case is what's happened already to a lot of our infrastructure. Country or countries unknown, although we have strong suspicions on the Agatha principle of who they are, have placed things like that in our power grid and in other vital infrastructure. If in the conventional case we'd ask ourselves, hey, would we go to war with North Korea simply over the acts of their agents placing these explosives that had killed no one and done nothing to anybody yet, but represented a threat? Would we consider that an act of war or an act of diplomacy? Would we arrest these people as criminals? Would we defuse the devices and protest the United Nations and cut off trade with, what would we do then? We should probably do the same thing and regard the harm done in the cyber case in the same way. And that's what I think, we need to frame it that way and then develop an appropriate set of answers. So.
Thank you, sir.
Right up here, last question for the evening.
Sir, Midshipman, third class FAO. A little bit of a follow-up to the last question. Cyber experts and the Department of Defense have framed that a cyber attack would be defined as denying, destroying, or disrupting U.S. infrastructure. Can you respond to the ethical implications of that policy, sir?
Yes, it's troubling that all those things are grouped together because, for example, denying is not the same thing as destroying. It can be, but it isn't necessarily. Distributed denial of service prevents you from, I don't know, accessing your ATM or making a phone call or getting your newspaper on your Kindle or something. And that's annoying. But nothing has been broken, nothing has been destroyed, no one's been killed. By contrast, an attack through a logic bomb planted inside a power plant or something that actually destroys physical pieces of the power plant and renders it inoperable is a different sort of thing.